In Ukraine, the country's government has now rejected an ultimatum to surrender the city of Mariupol. Well, there are varying claims about who may try to provide some kind of mediation to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Western sanctions appear to be having an impact on Russian society. Well, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said last week that there are people in his country who live in Russia but think like the West, and that they cannot be trusted. Well, where are we with all of this? Professor Robert Shearer is a Professor Emeritus of Politics at UCT. Professor, good afternoon to you. I really do appreciate the time. Thank you. It seems to me that a lot of what is happening, a lot of the diplomacy is really dependent on what's happening on the ground. I'm talking about the military situation. To read the Western media, they keep claiming that the Russian military is not able to make proper progress. How do you see it? Do you agree with that?
You know, we're dealing with a political process that is using military forces. It's not a military issue, it's a political issue. And at the moment there is one real, I think, reality at work. And that is, beneath all of the rhetoric, Russia is going to win the conflict but lose the war. And so we have this perhaps rather tragic situation that the conflict is not yet ripe for a peaceful resolution. It has to, in a sense, move forward, deteriorate more loss of lives before either party is really willing to make decisions of some kind of compromise. Putting it another way, the Russians, Putin, is not prepared to compromise, and the Ukrainians, Zelensky, not prepared to compromise. So the quagmire will continue, certainly for another few days or even weeks.
You say that Russia will win the conflict, maybe win the battle in a way, another way of putting it, but lose the war. Why do you say that? I mean, on the ground, militarily, Russia surely has military superiority over Ukraine.
The whole point, which we shouldn't forget, is that Putin saw the use of military force as having a political goal, and the political goal would be easily achieved with a minimum of military force. And that goal, of course, was the annexation, at best, for the Russians, of the Ukraine, because without the Ukraine, Russia is a small village in a world of large cities. So if you add Ukraine to Russia, you can then play in the big league of being a genuine superpower. So first prize would have been the annexation of Ukraine. Second prize, perhaps more realistic as Putin saw it, would have been for the present administration to have been removed, preferably liquidated, and a puppet regime to have been a close ally, a semi-independent state, but totally dependent upon Russia. Now, first and second prize have disappeared. They're not going to happen. So Putin has this dilemma of what to do. And I think my own tragic reading, knowing what one does about Putin, is that he plans essentially to devastate Ukraine, to leave the country in a pile of smoking bricks and rubble, and essentially say, we've taught Ukraine a lesson, we have killed Nazis with our bombing, now let the West rebuild the country. And of course, the Ukrainians will never again seek to move too close to the West, because they know we've got away with it twice now. First Ukraine, secondly, of course, verbally Crimea, and therefore for human memory, Ukraine will never again oppose Russia. And I think that's probably the best and also the worst that Putin will be able to get out of this.
I mean, this is a country of 44 million people. Well, it was 44 million people before the start of the invasion. I mean, different figures suggest that several million people have now left that country. But to try and change the sort of democratically expressed will of 44 million people is a very big thing to do. Did Putin just misjudge?
You know, it's interesting when, I would say, almost textbook scenarios come to pass. Textbooks tell us that tyrants, autocrats, the longer that they are in power, the more there is groupthink, the more people are yes men, the more people around them are mediocrities, and the more removed from reality the leader becomes. And I think it's very clear that this is exactly what has happened to Putin. for all sorts of reasons. He has been brooding in isolation. One can almost visualize him telling his close colleagues that Ukraine, as he said, is not a real country. They would really like to support the Russians, but of course the Nazis and all the others are preventing that. So with a little tap, with a little push, Ukraine will return to its Slavic roots. And one can imagine all the people around Putin agreeing with him. And I think it's very interesting what we've already seen happen. Putin has virtually admitted that the invasion of Ukraine was his idea. We also know that he is incredibly secretive, that he didn't tell even his closest advisors, and that's why this has been a disaster for Russia. Let me just take one obvious example. We all know that Russia had over $600 billion in foreign reserves in the banking system, and this was to deal with sanctions. Now, had the government been properly consulted, the Ministry of Economic Affairs would have said, if you're going to invade the Ukraine, we'd better get our money out of Western banks. They didn't, because they didn't know. So Putin is his own worst enemy because he believes he knows better than anybody else. And the other factor that we can tell is this incredible paranoia which Putin has always had and which in fact affects so much of his behavior. One could give you many examples, but just one ludicrous example. Putin has said in conversations which are reliably reported that one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State in the Barack Obama administration and why many senior women were in the Russia desk, Angela Stent, we know a lot of them have now come out, but the argument of Putin is that Obama specifically placed women in charge of Russian policy to humiliate him. Now, I'm pretty sure that this was the last thought that Obama had, the last thought that Hillary Clinton had. But Putin firmly believes that they were affirmative action appointments to humiliate him. So the way Putin sees the world is not the way we would perhaps see the world.
The other question then is what's going to happen now in Russian society. And I've heard various predictions that economy will shrink by perhaps 15, perhaps 20%. This is because of Western sanctions, a direct result of Western sanctions, which are themselves a response to the invasion of Ukraine. What that means is that many people in Russia are going to get poorer. Now, Professor, you know a lot more about the world and the history of the world than I do, but if you have people getting 20% poorer than they were, there are going to be political consequences.
Yes and no. I think that it's hard for perhaps people who think in democratic terms to understand what it's like to live in a repressive tyranny. Perhaps black South Africans would understand that feeling, but certainly in South Africa, whites wouldn't. And that is that feeling of total helplessness, of passivity. And I think that's what we've seen in Russia. First of all, the more poor people are, the less likely they are to organize. If you think of the old Soviet Union, people were poor and miserable, and they spent vast amount of time queuing for basic necessities, looking for simply any way to have food on the table, heat, water, and so on. So a poor, impoverished people, in fact, is almost a plus for Putin. So the elite will not suffer. We all know the elites have special shops, they have special access to the good things of life. So if the average Russian gets poorer, I think they'll become more passive and more depressed. The other factor, which has not been perhaps given the emphasis it should, is the incredible power of government propaganda. Putin is now moving towards a fully fledged police state. He's closed down the internet. He's closed down independent newspapers. He's closed down the last of the television independence. He's got rid of all the NGOs, the human rights groups. So he now has a monopoly of information for the vast majority of Russian people, which means that they will not have access to other alternative explanations, which means that they will by default support Putin and his government. So the threat to his regime will really come from the Siloviki, the elite around him, military commanders, perhaps a few oligarchs. The average Russian person really doesn't have to come into the equation when we talk about the prospects for Putin's survival.
That's on the one side of things. I mean, you made the point that in your view, you believe that Putin will sort of lose the war. Russia will lose the war. Russia, as we currently know it, or the person currently in charge of it. Is it also not the case that, well, in the days since the invasion, we've seen a very unified West? So we've seen NATO, the European Union, the United States particularly, really working together very quickly to impose those sanctions. The longer this goes on, and particularly in the United States, there are midterm elections coming up, etc., could we not start to see that unity start to falter a little bit? And if that happens, that would really strengthen Putin. I mean, is that a possibility? Is that something that we could see happen? Western nations just losing interest, that it stops being, you know, the lead story on their news websites?
No, I don't think it's going to quite work out that way, because Ukraine is going to remain a story. The human tragedy can only get worse. And certainly there will be blowback for Western economies. But I don't think it's going to vanish. The one factor that would change the equation is if Trump is re-elected American president. If that happens, there's a good chance the U.S. will go back to being anti-NATO and pro-Russia. So that's perhaps the one hope that Putin has, but that's too far in the future. I think the essential dilemma now is you have on the one hand Russia, which cannot attain the goals that it had of taking over Ukraine. So he's failed in that goal. None of the other options that face him are very attractive. Equally, for the Ukrainians, they cannot win the battle. They might win the war in the long term, but the cost will be horrendous. And we can see already Putin has basically said, all right, my military capabilities do not enable me to conquer Odessa and Kyiv, which are the two main areas. So what I'm going to do is simply destroy the country. And he's already indicated that if the massive conventional tools at his disposal don't work, he will be quite happy to bring in tactical nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, all sorts of unthinkables. So you're talking about a man absolutely ruthless, perhaps desperate to find some face-saving device, and that will come. I don't think there's much doubt that the end of this process will be some messy negotiated agreement. But Putin is determined to wreak his vengeance on the Ukrainians and make them pay a very heavy price. And it's fairly obvious the dynamic. I think earlier one would have perhaps said that the issue of NATO and the expansion of NATO was a major factor behind Putin. But I think we can now see that NATO was a fig leaf. Putin does not want an independent Ukraine. And if you look at the basket case that the Russian economy is and the deterioration that will take place, one can see why the Ukraine would find the West so much more attractive in terms of getting its economy going, a better life for its people. So Putin now has to find that face-saving device, mechanism, and I think the path will be the virtual destruction of Ukraine.
Professor, thank you very much indeed, Professor Robert Shearer, Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Cape Town.